I have traded horses on the Antler River for the better part of my life, and I will tell you the truth that took me longest to learn. A man can read every animal that ever wore a halter and still not know the first thing about his own heart until somebody walks up and shows it to him. She showed me mine on a gray morning at the Cottonwood crossing, with the river up over its banks and a brown colt half drowned in the willows, and I have never once been sorry. My name is Isaac Crane. I was 41 that spring, and I had been alone for 9 years. I dealt in horses, broke them, traded them, drove them up out of the breaks where the wild bands ran, and sold them gentle to whoever would pay an honest price. I kept a place at Cottonwood Bend, 2 miles below the town of Sumner, a sod-roofed cabin and a pole corral and a stretch of good grass nobody else wanted because it flooded 1 year in 5. I liked it because it was quiet. I told myself I liked being alone. A man tells himself a great many things to keep from hearing the wind. Sumner was a hard little town strung along the river, a store, a smithy, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a great deal of opinion for so few people. The opinion that mattered most, the one everybody carried like a watch in their vest, was that the river band who camped upstream were not to be trusted. Nobody in Sumner could have told you why, not in a way that would hold. The band had been on that river longer than the town had a name. They ran fine horses. They kept to themselves and traded fair and asked nothing of anybody. But fear does not need a reason. It only needs a stranger to point at, and the band were strangers in their own country by then, which is the cruelest kind of stranger to be. I traded with them. That was the whole of my sin, as far as Sumner was concerned. I rode up the river 2 or 3 times a season and dealt straight, and they dealt straight back, and over the years a careful respect had grown between us, the kind 2 honest men build when neither one fully trusts the world they have to live in. The head man, a wide-shouldered older man with gray coming into his braids, had a way of looking at a horse's mouth and then at my face that told me he was pricing both. I respected that. I priced him the same way. It was at their camp that I first saw the woman who would unmake my whole quiet life, though I did not know it then. She was losing a knot in a pack-horse's mane with her teeth, both hands full of rawhide, laughing at something her brother had said, and she did not so much as glance at me. I marked her the way you mark a good horse in a crowded corral, without meaning to, and not able to stop. Then I went back to my dickering, and I rode home, and I did not think on her again for a month, which only goes to show how little a man knows about what is already deciding his life. The river came up that may like it meant to take the country back. 3 days of warm rain on the gray-capped snowpack, and the Antler ran the color of a saddle and twice as fast. I should have stayed off it. I had 2 colts to bring across to the South Grass before the flood cut me off for a week, and I am as stubborn as any man who has spent his life arguing with animals, so I took them down to the Cottonwood crossing where the gravel bar usually let a horse wade. There was no gravel bar that morning. There was a brown flood and a sound like a freight wagon going downhill forever, and there was a horse in the willows on the far side, lunging and tangled and going under, and there was a woman in the water with her arm hooked around its neck, trying to keep its head up by main strength, which is not a thing strength can do. I did not think. There is a kind of moment where thinking is the enemy. I dropped my lead ropes and put my own horse into the river at an angle, the way you do, letting the current carry us down to them instead of fighting straight across, and I got a rope on the drowning colt's neck and dallied it to my saddle horn and let my horse, a steady old gray named Pilot who had pulled more fools out of more rivers than I could count, do the work. Pilot dug in and hauled, and the colt came, and the woman came with it because she would not let go. We fetched up on a sandspit 100 yards down, all 4 of us heaving like bellows. The colt stood with its legs splayed, blowing water out its nose, and the woman stood up out of the mud and shoved her wet hair back off her face and looked at me, not grateful, not frightened, just looking, taking my measure the same way the headman did with a horse's mouth, and she said, in plain English with the river still running off her chin, "You came in crooked." "I did," I said. "That was right," she nodded at the spot. "Straight across the river takes you. I know. Most men don't. She wrung out her sleeve like she was deciding something. You're the horse trader, Crane. Crane, you're. Naya. She said it the way you set down a thing you don't intend to pick back up for just anybody. Then she went to the shivering colt and ran her hands down its legs, checking for breaks, talking to it low in her own tongue, and the colt dropped its head and leaned into her like she was its own dam. I had spent 20 years learning to do what she did in 10 seconds. I have thought a great deal since about that morning, about how if I had stayed home like a sensible man, my life would have run on quiet and gray and empty as the river in August, and I'd never have known what I was missing, which is the saddest kind of peace there is. But I went to the crossing, and the river was up, and she was there, and that was that. The rest of my life turned on a rope and a sandspit and a woman who told me I'd come in crooked. I could not get her out of my head after that, and it shamed me some, a man my age. I told myself it was the way she handled the colt. I am a poor liar, even to myself. I found reasons to ride up the river more than my trade required. I told the headman I was looking for a particular kind of stock, a deep-chested gray line they bred that I could sell south for good money, which was true enough. But a man does not need to visit a camp 6 times in a summer to buy 3 horses. The headman knew it. He had a wry, weathered patience about him, and a way of saying nothing that said everything. The first few times, Naya kept her distance and watched me work, arms folded, the way you'd watch a strange dog to see if it would bite. I did not push. I have gentled enough green colts to know that the worst thing you can do is reach for a thing before it's ready to be reached for. You make yourself useful and quiet, and you wait, and you let it come to you, and the day it does, you have something no amount of force could ever have bought. So I made myself useful. There was a stud colt in their band, a black 2-year-old with a mind like a thunderhead, that 3 of their young men had given up on. I asked, with signs and the few words I had, if I might try him. The headman lifted one shoulder. Be my guest, break your fool neck. I worked that colt slow, in the round corral they'd made of brush and rope, an hour at a time across 4 visits, asking for nothing he wasn't ready to give. Until the morning he followed me around that pen with his nose at my shoulder like we'd been partners since the world was made. When I looked up, Naya was sitting on the top rail watching, and she was not folding her arms anymore. You don't hurry, she said. Hurry's how you ruin a good horse. And a good many other things. She dropped off the rail and came into the pen, and the black colt swung toward her, and she put her hand flat on his neck, and the 3 of us stood there a while in the dust and the bee hum, not saying much. Then she taught me the word for horse in her tongue, and the word for river, and the word for the kind of morning where the light comes up gold off the wet grass, which her people had a single word for and mine did not, and which I have thought was the truest sign of all, that they understood things my own people had forgotten how to see. That was how it went all that long warm summer, word for word. I taught her the trader's English for the things a horse can do, the names of gaits, the soundness checks, the slow art of reading a hoof, and she taught me her language a piece at a time, and more than that, she taught me to read the country. She could look at a hillside and tell you which way the elk had crossed it 2 days back and whether the wind had shifted since. She could kneel in dust I'd ridden over without a second glance and tell me a shod horse had passed and how heavy a man rode it and whether he'd been in a hurry. I had thought I knew that country. I had been living on the skin of it. She knew its bones. I learned her people too, the way you learn anything worth knowing, by being among them and keeping my mouth shut. They were not the shadows the town had made of them. They were a people, the same as any other, with their bores and their wits and their grandmothers who ran everything from behind a wall of mild remarks. There was an old woman, Naya's grandmother, who I never once saw stand up and who I came to fear more than any man in Sumner, because she missed nothing and forgave nothing and could empty a braggart with a single dry word. There was Naya's brother, a quick laughing fellow named Tam who could ride anything and rope nothing, and who decided early that my coming was the funniest thing to happen on the river in years. There were children who tore through the camp like quail. There was grief there, too. They had lost people, to sickness, and to the kind of hard government dealing I will not pretend I'm clean of by being white. And they carried it the way all people carry grief, in the quiet between the laughing. And there was Naya at the center of all of it, not because anyone put her there but because she could not help it. She had buried a husband 2 winters back, a young man thrown breaking a horse. She told me once plainly, the way she told everything, with the grief worn down smooth as a creek stone. She had no children. She had her hands and her eye and her own opinions, and she kept her own string of horses that were hers and nobody else's, and she answered to no man living, and the headman, who I came to understand was her uncle, deferred to her on stock matters in a way that told me she had earned it the hard way. I will not pretend I courted her the way a man courts a woman in town, with calls and dances. There were no dances for us. There was no place in the whole country where we'd have been welcome to sit down together, not in Sumner, where I'd have been a squaw man and she a target, and not, I think at first, in her own camp, where I was a useful curiosity and nothing more. So what we built sideways in the only room the world left us, in the round corral over a sick foal, riding out to count a band on the far benches. We built it out of work, which is the most honest thing 2 people can build anything out of. I knew I loved her on a morning in late summer when we'd ridden up onto the sweetgrass after a colt that had jumped its hobbles. We found it grazing easy at the head of a coulee, and there was no hurry, and we sat our horses a while looking out over the whole spread of the country, the river a bright wire below and the gray caps blue and far. And she said, without looking at me, "My grandmother says you are the only one of them who looks at us like we are real." "You are real," I said, which was a foolish thing to say, but it was what was in me. "I know that." She did look at me then. "The question is whether you can keep on knowing it when it costs you something. Most of them can't. They knew it once too." I did not have an answer good enough for that, so I gave her the only true one I had. "I've spent 9 years not letting anything cost me anything," I said. "It's a poor way to live. I'd rather pay." She didn't say anything back, but when we rode down off the bench she rode close, knee almost to my knee the whole way, and that was an answer. It would be a finer story if I could tell you the country let us be. It did not. The country was Sumner, and Sumner had been watching. A man named Doyle ran the saloon and most of the talk that came out of it, and Doyle had decided some time back that the river band were thieves who simply hadn't been caught yet, and that I was their man in town. There is a kind of fellow who needs an enemy the way other men need water, and Doyle was that kind. He'd ride out past my place going nowhere in particular just to be seen counting my stock. And twice that summer I came back from the river to find my corral gate open and 3 horses gone, got back the next morning every time, drifting home on their own, which is not how stolen horses behave, but Doyle was not a man troubled by what was so. The smith, a broad, quiet man named Heller, warned me. Heller was decent, one of the few. He'd shoe a band horse without comment when Tam brought one in, and he'd take the hard looks for it. "Crane," he told me one evening low, with the forge ticking as it cooled, "you want to watch yourself. There's talk you've thrown in with them. Doyle's been saying it loud. Loud talk has a way of needing to prove itself." "Let it talk," I said, with the easy stupidity of a man who has not yet been afraid for anyone but himself. "It's not you I'd worry for," Heller said, and that landed because he'd seen, the way the whole town had started to see, where I rode and how often. "A man can stand a deal of talk. The river folks can't afford a single false word. You know that better than I do." I did know it. That was the part that sat in my chest like a stone all the ride home. I'd been so busy learning to live that I'd forgotten what living can cost the people you love when the world has already decided to hate them. Naya had told me as much, up on the sweetgrass, in fewer words. I'd just been too happy to hear it. The winter came down early and mean. It came down the way it does in that country once in a decade, a blue norther that dropped the world to white in an afternoon and then sat on it for 6 weeks. The antler froze solid bank to bank. Stock died standing up. I lost 4 head the first storm, and would have lost more if Tam hadn't ridden down through the worst of it to help me drive my band into the willow bottoms where they'd break the wind. 12 miles he came, in cold that killed, because I was, by then, theirs to look after the same as they were mine. And it was that winter that the band took me in for good, though not the way the soft stories tell it. There was no grand moment, no chief's daughter offered like a prize. There was just a night, the worst night of the worst storm, when the camp's wood was running low, and a child took sick with the lung fever. And I was up there because I'd hauled a sledge of cottonwood across the river ice on a hunch they'd be short. And Naya and I and her grandmother sat up with that child until dawn, taking turns keeping steam over him and the fire fed. And somewhere in the black middle of that night, Naya reached over without a word and put her cold hand in my cold hand, and we just held on, the two of us, while the child's breath fought for itself in the dark. He lived. Toward morning his fever broke and he slept easy, and the grandmother looked at the two of us, our hands still locked together on the buffalo robe between us, and she said something in her tongue, and Naya's face did a thing I'd never seen it do, and I asked what her grandmother had said, and Naya said, "She says the horse trader can stop pretending he comes up here for horses." I laughed. I couldn't help it with that child breathing easy and that woman's hand in mine, and that fierce old woman seeing clean through me the way she saw through everyone. "She's right," I said. "I haven't come up here for horses since May." "I know," Naya said. "Neither have I been letting you for horses." And that was as much courting as either of us ever did or needed. The headman married us that winter by their custom, which I will not lay out here because some things are not for telling on a page, only for living. I brought what a man brings, which among her people meant horses, but not as a price, never as a price. I want that understood because the world has a filthy way of turning love into purchase. Among her people, a man's gift of horses is a saying out loud of what he means to be, that he'll provide, that he comes with his hands full and his intentions plain. The horses went to her family as an honoring, and Naya kept her own string still, her own counsel still, her own road open still. The headman made that part plain to me with the grandmother watching like a hawk. She was not given to me and she was not bought. She had chosen, and a choosing can be unchosen, and my whole job from that day was to make sure she'd never want to. I have tried to do that job. It is the only one I've ever truly cared about. We came through the winter. The ice broke up in March with a sound like the world cracking open, and the grass came green on the benches, and we had a home, not in Sumner, never in Sumner, but a home all the same between the worlds at Cottonwood Bend and up the river both, with my corral and her people's camp, and the country we knew the bones of stretched out between like a thing we held in common. I had thought I was alone by nature. I learned that winter I'd only been alone by accident, and that the accident was over. It might have stayed sweet if the world were kind. The world is not kind. It is only, now and again, survivable. It was a moonless night in the green of that next May, a year near enough since the river had given her to me, that a dozen good saddle horses went out of Sumner. They were taken slick and quiet from corrals all over town, the best stock in the country, gone between dark and dawn, and when Sumner woke to it, the town did not look for thieves. It already had its thieves. It had decided on them a generation back. By full light, Doyle had 40 riders gathered in front of his saloon with their rifles and their certainty, and they were not riding out to find who done it. They were riding up the river to make the river band pay for it, and they did not much care whether the paying fit the crime. Heller came for me at a dead run, his horse blowing. "Crane, they're getting up a party for the camp. Doyle's leading it. He's saying it's the band, he's saying it plain, and there's enough of them scared and stupid to do it." The smith's honest face was gray. "They mean to ride right up there. There's children in that camp." I was on pilot before he'd finished, but I made myself stop at the gate, because panic is the enemy the same as hurry, and I made myself think the way Naya had taught me to think, not about what I feared, but about what the country could tell me. 12 horses do not vanish into air. 12 horses leave a road a blind man could follow if he'd only kneel down and look instead of looking for somebody to blame. Heller, I said, ride up the river ahead of them. Find Tam, find anybody, tell them to break camp back into the breaks and not to fight, not for anything, no matter what's said. Tell them I'm coming and I'm bringing the truth with me if I have to dig it out of the ground with my hands. Can you do that? He could. He was a decent man and he went. And I went the other way. I rode into Sumner against the whole tide of that mob, and I went to the first robbed corral, the one behind the store, and I got down off my horse in front of all of them, and I knelt in the churned mud of the gate and I read it. You have to understand, I had been a year in the best school there is. I had a teacher who could read the bones of the country, and she had not been stingy with the teaching. I knelt in that gateway with Doyle's riders milling and jeering behind me, and the tracks told me their story plain as print. The horses had gone out south, not up the river toward the band, south, down country, toward the breaks below town. They'd been driven by shod horses, 3 of them, white men's horses with white men's iron, one of them with a broken nail in the off hind that left a mark you could not mistake. And the thieves had been smart but not smart enough. They'd cut a length of bottom fence and tried to make the gap look like the work of someone who didn't know the place. But no stranger cuts a fence in the one spot the dogs can't see. Whoever did this knew Sumner's dogs. I stood up with mud on my knees, and I said it loud enough for 40 men to hear. These horses went south. Not up the river. Shod stock, 3 drivers, white men, riding for the breaks below the bend. The band never came near this town last night, and you all know it. You just don't want to. Doyle laughed at me, because that is what his kind does instead of thinking. And we're to take the word of a squaw man over plain sense, he said, and there was an ugly sound from the riders behind him. You're to take the word of the ground, I said. The ground doesn't lie. You can. It can't. Get down off your horse and look, Doyle, or are you afraid of what's under your own feet? He would not get down. They never will. But Heller's brother was there, and the storekeeper whose own horse was gone, and one by one a few of them did climb down and kneel where I'd knelt, and a man does not need to be a tracker to see a broken nail print once it's pointed out to him. The certainty went out of the mob a piece at a time, like air out of a bladder, and I felt the thing turning and I pressed it. You want your horses back, I said. Follow me south. You want to murder women and children for a crime that points the other way, then you'll have to come through me first and through the smith and through every decent man here, and you'll have to live the rest of your lives knowing what you are. Your pick. We rode south. Not all of them. Doyle peeled off with a handful of his worst and went home, which told its own story to anyone watching. But the storekeeper came, and Heller, and a dozen others who'd only needed somebody to give them the road back to their own better sense. And we found the horses where the ground said they'd be, in a box canyon down in the breaks, held by 3 men who'd figured the band would take the blame, and no one would ever ride south to check. They were Doyle's own kind. One of them had drunk in Doyle's saloon the night before, loud, making sure he'd be remembered in town while his partners worked the corrals. The broken nail was on the off hind of the bay he tried to bolt on. There was no killing. I want that set down. 3 men with the truth riding up on them in broad daylight do not generally fight 40. They put up their hands and started lying, which is a different thing, and the lies didn't hold any better than the fence had. We brought them and the horses back to Sumner, and the country sorted out the rest of it the way the country did in those days, which was rougher than I'd choose, but which fell on the men who'd earned it and not on the camp by the river, and that was all I'd ridden for. But I had not ridden for the camp alone, and there is one more thing to tell, the thing that matters most, the thing this whole long story was only ever leading to. When it was done, when the horses were back in their corrals, and the thieves were in the storekeeper's root cellar that served Sumner for a jail, and the dust was settling on a town that had come within a mob's width of doing a thing it could never have washed off, I did not stay for the thanks. There wasn't much thanks anyway. A town that has nearly done murder is not in a grateful humor with the man who stopped it. I got on Pilot and I rode up the river to the camp hard, because I had to know they were safe, and I had to see her face. The camp had not run. That was the first thing. They'd pulled the children back into the breaks the way I'd asked, but the headman and the men had stayed, mounted and waiting in the open with their old rifles, ready to die on their own ground rather than be hunted off it, and the sight of them sitting there in the failing light, having held that line all day on nothing but my word carried by Heller, near unmanned me. They had trusted me. They had bet their lives on a horse trader's promise. I do not think I will ever in this life be paid a thing as dear as that again, and I had not earned it. You cannot earn a thing like that. You can only spend the rest of your days trying to deserve it after the fact. Naya came out of the brush leading her own horse, and she walked straight to where I'd stopped, and she looked up at me, and for once her face hid nothing at all. "It's done," I said. "It was 3 of theirs down in the breaks, like the ground said. Your people are clear. The whole town knows it, and the ones that matter believe it." My voice went out from under me some. "Nobody's coming up this river. Not tonight. Not over this." She put her hand on my knee, the way she'd ridden close that first day on the sweetgrass, and she said something to her uncle, the headman, who had ridden up behind her, and he answered, and there was a long quiet exchange among the men that I could not follow and did not try to. Then the headman turned his horse, and the others turned with him, and they rode back toward the camp, and left the 2 of us alone in the dusk with the river running, and the first stars coming out over the gray caps. "What did he say?" I asked. "He said the white man came back up the river when he could have ridden the other way and never been faulted for it." She was not letting go of my knee. "He said a man who rides toward the thing instead of away from it has a place at any fire he wants for the rest of his life." Her eyes were wet, which I had seen exactly once before, the night the child's fever broke. "He said you have a place at mine." "I had that already," I said. "You gave it to me a year ago in the snow." "I did," she almost smiled. "But it's a different thing to be given a place and to have your people stand up in the open and say you've earned it. Today my people said it, in front of everyone." She drew a breath. "Get down off that horse, Asa Crane, and come home. You've been coming in crooked for a year, and it's been right every single time, but I'd like you to come all the way in now." I got down off the horse. We've had a long life since, longer than either of us had any cause to expect, and not an easy one, because the world did not get kinder. It only got older alongside us. There were years the country still wanted to call her a squaw and me a squaw man, and there were doors that stayed shut to us in Sumner till the day the people who'd shut them died and were buried, and even after. But there were other years, too. There were the horses, always the horses, the deep-chested grays out of her family's line that I bred up at the Bend and sold honest, the colts she gentled in half the time it took me, the whole long-shared craft of it that never once ran dry between us. There was her grandmother, who lived to be older than seemed possible and who let me know, in the only way she ever showed approval, which was by complaining about me less and less, that I'd come out acceptable. There was Tam, who never did learn to rope, but who was the best uncle to our children that any children ever had. For we had children in time. I will not put them on this page. They're grown now, and they have their own country and their own troubles and their own joys, and that's theirs. I'll say only that they grew up able to read the bones of the land their mother read, and to speak both her tongue and mine, and to look at people the way she taught me to look, like they are real, all of them, every one, and that of all the things I've made in my life, gentling green horses and breaking sod and building a home where the world said no home could stand. Those children are the only ones I'd stake my whole account on at the end. I am an old man now. I sit out in the evenings at Cottonwood Bend and watch the antler run the same as it ran the morning it brought her to me, and I think about how a man can spend half his life believing he likes to be alone, building his quiet so high around himself he can't hear the wind, and how it can all come down in a single morning at a flooded crossing, with a brown colt drowning and a woman who tells him he came in crooked. She is beside me yet, gray now as I am gray, her hands still quick when there's a sick foal that needs them. We do not talk a great deal in the evenings. We never did need to. We learned each other word by word across a divide the whole world swore could not be crossed, and we crossed it, and we built a home in the very middle of it where no home was supposed to stand, and it stood. It is standing yet. A man learns one true thing if he lives long enough. I learned it on a sandspit with the river running off my chin and a woman taking my measure. The whole world will tell you what cannot be done, who cannot love whom, what divides cannot be crossed, what homes cannot be built. The whole world is wrong about nearly all of it. You only have to be willing to ride toward the thing instead of away. You only have to be willing to come in crooked and pay what it costs and earn your place at the fire. I came in crooked. It was right every single time, and I am sitting at her fire still.